Stepping into the foray of presidential politics for the first time since his own failed bid for the nomination earlier last year, New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio has decided to endorse Bernie Sanders in his bid for the Democratic nomination. Now, I know that there are a number of progressives out there who are maybe a little bit critical of de Blasio at this point, given that, he had endorsed Hillary Clinton last time around over Bernie Sanders and his failure to support Zephyr Teachout in 2000, I think 2014, and Cynthia Nixon in 2018, two progressive members who, Bernie and Warren had backed in New York. And, so he's kind of lost a lot of good faith in the progressive community for those reasons. Now, I actually do think that, whatever you think of Bill de Blasio, this is actually a pretty good endorsement, given that, look, at this point, the big concern right now is, of course, whether or not they're going to try to screw over Bernie Sanders when it comes to the convention, and having more so establishment, but still, slightly more to the left members on your side is going to be really important for, making sure that they don't ultimately screw over Bernie Sanders at the convention. Because once you have those kinds of establishment endorsements, provided of course that Bernie Sanders isn't bending over to get those endorsements, right? Because the problem with getting those kinds of establishment endorsements has always been, the criticism always was that, look, you go out for these establishment endorsements thinking that they're going to make a difference when they, of course, never do. So you go out trying to get these endorsements, but in order to get those endorsements, you make concessions on policy. That is not what Bernie Sanders has done. Bernie Sanders didn't make any concessions in order to get this endorsement. And to be fair, you can criticize here and say, well, hold on, Bill de Blasio waited until it looked like Bernie Sanders was in a really, really strong, sort of strong place to endorse. He didn't endorse, for instance, when AOC did. AOC endorsing back in October, right after Bernie Sanders had a heart attack. And obviously, there are no consultants, no strategists out there who would have told AOC to do something like that. And in many respects, it really was AOC's endorsement of Bernie Sanders, which helped him kind of, really sort of coalesce, bring together the progressive side of the party, and, in so doing, really help Bernie Sanders surge up in the polls, and, as win the popular vote in Iowa and then win out in New Hampshire. But in the case of de Blasio, yes, he did wait, and so you can criticize him on that point. But, in some respects, it's kind of like, better late than never. Like, as progressives, we can't be damned if you do, damned if you don't, right? We can't be like, oh, why didn't you endorse sooner, and then criticize them for ever endorsing in the first place. We still want you to endorse and to help us out. So, you kind of have to be a little bit forgiving in that sense. Obviously, we would have wanted him to endorse earlier, but he didn't. Now, there's a few things I want to talk a little bit about when it comes to this endorsement. And by the way, de Blasio has been trying to make a lot more sort of concessions, make a better outreach to the progressive movement for the past couple years. After the Hillary Clinton debacle, endorsing Hillary Clinton, he had said later that he did believe that Bernie Sanders would have beaten Donald Trump in the election, which caused a lot of grief among Hillary Clinton staffers. And by the way, even with the case of Hillary Clinton's endorsement, he actually waited a long time to endorse Hillary Clinton, a lot longer than many other people, and it actually did outrage Hillary Clinton and the Clintons in general. In fact, they did in fact punish him out in Iowa, where they had him knocking doors instead of actually giving any kind of speeches in Iowa, and that really upset de Blasio. And so there's kind of bad blood between him and the Clintons at this point. And he did have Bernie Sanders swear, de Blasio had Bernie Sanders swear him in at his nomination, at his inauguration the second time around. Now, what I sort of want to talk a little bit about here is, well, first, this is the Politico article here, and they try to spin this endorsement as, I don't know if you can read it here, how it's really just about advancing his own political interest. And this article here is basically just like a massive hit piece on de Blasio, and by extension, kind of a hit piece on Bernie. It's kind of like they're coming around saying like, oh yeah, well, he did endorse him, but he only did it for self-interested political reasons. And so it's kind of like trying to inverse weirdly, like make the endorsement not count for anything, not matter for anything. And it is the way that I've seen a number of media outlets trying to spin this endorsement, and that's just simply not fair. I mean, you can criticize de Blasio, but de Blasio is not in any way as bad as some other members of Congress, some other mayors. I mean, and he's certainly infinitely better than Bloomberg, the mayor previously, which, by the way, very well could have played into de Blasio's endorsement because, he actually genuinely does not like Michael Bloomberg, like on kind of a personal level. So I've seen some people speculating that this endorsement, while yes, strategic, and yes, he's trying to, sort of try to rebuild good faith with the progressive community. It's also him on a personal level just trying to hit Michael Bloomberg because he doesn't like the guy. I mean, just about in almost every single clip you can see from de Blasio, just about every opportunity he gets, he tries to slam Michael Bloomberg. And so there's also kind of personal issues, sort of personal stuff going on here. Now, the thing I do want to bring up here is, so this is a poll of South Carolina. The reason why why de Blasio's endorsement actually could really matter is because de Blasio actually is pretty favorable, is looked on with decent favorability among the African American community, and not just in New York City and not just sort of in that region, but generally around the country. De Blasio, has kind of a decent connection, a good connection, good faith connection with the African American community. As far as I know, I mean, of course, there are criticisms you can make, and he's not perfect, but in general, the polling for him among African Americans has been pretty good. And if you look at, this is the most recent South Carolina poll. Biden obviously slipping, really just falling off a cliff, even in South Carolina. It's no longer a sure thing that he's going to win South Carolina, with Bernie Sanders surging up 6 points in this poll for South Carolina. But it's quite possible now with de Blasio being able to, campaign for Bernie Sanders now in Nevada and then also in South Carolina. Of course, the possibility is that it could be enough to sort of tip Bernie Sanders over the top, especially if he's able to ultimately make a win out in Nevada. In fact, if you look at the Real Clear Politics average, you can see here Bernie Sanders is coming up. I mean, there isn't, unfortunately, nearly as many polls as there as there was from, going into Iowa and going into New Hampshire, now that we're, sort of a little bit more into the nominating cycle. But there's still some polls coming out, and you can actually still take a look. So if you look at the previous poll, this East Carolina University, actually the Post-Courier poll, really all of them, if you look at the former versions of their polls, so the Post-Courier poll had Biden up at 7 and then Biden up at 5. And then, this East Carolina poll has him up at 8, and then the previous one had him up over 18. So even though it still has Biden up a little bit, if you compare it by the specific poll that it was, Biden is clearly losing ground, and he's not just losing ground in South Carolina. If you look at the national numbers, Biden has been absolutely falling off a cliff while Sanders has continued to surge. The myth that Bernie Sanders has some kind of ceiling doesn't seem to really hold true. In fact, if you look at some of the morning consult poll numbers, Bernie Sanders is the second choice among a lot of other groups. So the idea that there's kind of a progressive wing and then there's a kind of moderate wing, there's a lot more overlap than we might initially sort of assume. So anyway, that's the video. I just wanted to sort of update you on that and talk a little bit about it. In any case, if you like the video, I'd really appreciate it if you hit the like button and consider subscribing. Thanks.